Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to you, depending on where you are joining the CGA lecture series today. This is the last lecture for the Center for Global Asia at the New York University in Shanghai we'll be organizing for this year, 2022. I'm Bhagya Senaratne, presently a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Global Asia at the New York University, Shanghai. I'm currently on special leave, postdoctoral leave from my teaching appointment as a senior lecturer at the Department of Strategic Studies at General Sir John Kotalawala Defense University, Sri Lanka, so that I can be here in Shanghai. We have with us here today Dr. Muhammad Tayyab Safdar, who will be speaking to us on the BRI in National Peripheries, Gwadar, and the limits of outsourced development, a joint research with Hamal Aslam. You can submit questions to him using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen during his presentation. Now, it's with immense pleasure that I wish to introduce Dr. Tayyab Safdar, who's a friend of the Center for Global Asia and a collaborator. Dr. Tayyab Safdar is currently a postdoctoral researcher of the assessment of China's Belt and Road Initiative at the University of Virginia. He completed his MPhil and PhD in development studies from the University of Cambridge. His research looks at the economic and political dimensions of increasing Chinese investment on host countries that are a part of the Belt and Road Initiative, more commonly known as the BRI, focusing particularly on China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CPEC. Dr. Safdar's research has been published in the Journal of Development Studies and Energy for Sustainable Development. Prior to joining UVA, Dr. Safdar was a Newton Trust postdoctoral researcher at the Center for Development Studies, University of Cambridge. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Safdar will be speaking to us about the BRI in National Peripheries, Gwadar, and the limits of outsourced development. Over the next 40 minutes or so, Dr. Safdar will speak of why the CPEC, as it is commonly known, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, is an important pilot project of China's Belt and Road Initiative. He will reflect on the privileged position Gwadar enjoys in this project and why this is the case. His research with Hamal Aslam explains why there's a lack of progress, despite Gwadar's privileged position within CPEC and the BRI. Now, before I hand the floor over to Dr. Safdar, I would like to once again remind you that you're welcome to submit your questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And at the end of this talk, we will have about 30 minutes or so to engage in a lively discussion with him about his research, the CPEC, and various discussions about Pakistan's engagement with the Belt and Road Initiative. With that, it's over to you, Tayyab.
Thank you very much, Bhagya. Thank you very much to the Center for Global Asia, especially Tansen and the rest of the team. Thank you so much for inviting me. So let me just share my screen so that we get that out of the way. The screen's visible? Yeah, great.
Yes, it is.
Great. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's really an honor for me to join you guys. I'm in Pakistan at the moment, so it's not early morning for me, so it's early evening for me. But I know that Tansen has early morning, so thank you very much for joining, those of you who are joining from the US. So this paper's been in the works for quite a bit of time. I started working on it in 2019, and then other things happened, and then I stopped. And now I'm currently working on it with Hamal Aslam, who's based at the Balochistan University of Information Technology, Engineering and Management Sciences. And the arguments, as we go through the presentation, you'll sort of see the flow of the argument, which sort of looks at how the BRI interacts with national peripheries. What's interesting as far as the BRI literature is concerned is that there's been a lot of discussion about whether and how China is moving from a semi-peripheral country within the global capitalist world system, to use the world systems theory jargon, to the core, and whether these sort of spatio-temporal infrastructure fixes like the Belt and Road Initiative, whether they can help China achieve this goal of becoming one of the core sort of components of the global capitalist system. There's a very interesting paper, 2017, by Chang in Geopolitics, which sort of looks at why China has had to, sort of launch the Belt and Road Initiative, looking at especially problems of overcapacity within the Chinese, manufacturing sector, especially, but other sectors of the economy as well, as China moves from a semi-peripheral to a core economy. Other work by Min-Chi Lee, once again, is extremely interesting, which sort of argues that China is still a semi-peripheral country as far as its relations with the core in the global north is concerned. However, in terms of China's relationship with countries in the south, especially in sub-Saharan Africa and in South Asia, China is very much has taken on this role of a core as it exports capital to these parts of to these underdeveloped, parts of the world. But what's missing in the literature to a large extent is this discussion of how Chinese interests and Chinese actors interact with local actors within national peripheries. As a lot of these projects, especially in the infrastructure realm, are undertaken in areas that are not part of the core as far as many of these developing countries are concerned. I and my co-author feel that this is a very useful lens in order to understand how the different Chinese actors are engaging with different parts of the world that are not part of the core national cores. And what are some of the challenges that they face as they interact with multiple different, domestic actors within these spaces as they move across national borders. So the case study that we look at, it's a case study-based research, is Gwadar. And Gwadar is very interesting for a number of different reasons. The number of times that the Pakistani state or the Pakistani establishment, political actors, including, talk about Gwadar and as a game changer I've lost count. So Gwadar is extremely interesting. Gwadar is also interesting because the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor is often touted as the pilot project as far as the Belt and Road Initiative is concerned. And Gwadar, being the southwestern terminus of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, already has a privileged position as far as the BRI is concerned. So the way that the presentation is going to run is I'm going to talk about the theory or the theoretical, sort of framework or the construct that we'll be using to inform our research. And then I'll sort of take a step forward and talk about Balochistan as a periphery as far as Pakistan is concerned, and then sort of take it to Gwadar. So this whole literature on internal peripheries is, of course, influenced to a large extent by Immanuel Wallerstein and his work on world systems theory. There are other, sort of world system theorists like Andre Gunder Frank and Giovanni Righi, who've also enriched the literature on the world, system on world systems theory. And we have the division of the world in the core, periphery, and then semi-peripheral areas, with the advanced world being the core, as as they take on most of the functions that give high returns, and then you've got the periphery and then the semi-peripheral areas as well. However, a very interesting study in 1975 by Hector talks about or takes a focus on internal colonialism, and he does so in the context of England and its relationship with its fringe economies, as he calls it, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland. And then Nolte, in the 1995 paper, once again, really interesting, talks about how even though the world systems theory takes a, sort of a macro picture as far as the world is concerned, he talks about how there are hierarchical organizations within nation states as well. So while, on a macro sort of a plane, there are these hierarchies in the world where you've got your core, your semi-peripheries, and your peripheries. Nolte argues that these divisions exist within the nation state as well. So a country might be peripheral, for example, a country like Pakistan might be peripheral as far as the capitalist world system is concerned. However, Pakistan would have its own core semi-peripheral and peripheral areas within that, sort of a smaller regional construct of the nation state. And the idea very much is that these spaces, these internal peripheries, are organized in a way to benefit those that are based in the core areas. And again, as we go through the presentation, we can sort of see how that sort of works within the context of Pakistan as well. A lot of the literature focuses on Europe, and it looks at how, European regional development worked, especially in Western and Eastern Germany. Once again, so that sort of European focus as far as this literature on internal peripheries is concerned is there. But there are a number of structural disadvantages that face these internal peripheries. For example, the GDP per capita, so economic development within these internal peripheries is usually lower as compared with core areas within the national economy as well. And we can see that in the case of Pakistan. So if we assume that the Punjab is a core area as far as Pakistan or the Pakistani nation state is concerned, the Balochistan, parts of Balochistan, parts of Gilgit-Baltistan, which are very much part of the periphery as far as the Pakistani state is concerned, have lower GDP per capita. Similarly, these parts also suffer from lower productivity levels. There are a number of reasons due to which productivity levels could be different or lower in these parts of the world. Furthermore, because social spending or spending by the state is lower, you have lower education standards. So it is highly likely that a larger portion of the population or a larger percentage of the population has lower access to education. So therefore, education levels are going to be lower. They also have limited access to services because these areas themselves are marginal to the state proper. So therefore, access to public services is also lower, which sort of brings us to the fact that state capacity in these areas, or the ability or the hold of the state within these peripheral areas, is also likely to be lower, which sort of explains why education and public service delivery and all of those things are likely to be different. Furthermore, because they do not have, these areas do not have a lot of political voice as far as the nation state is concerned, so therefore there's likely to be fiscal discrimination. So the overall pool of divisible resources, these areas, because of lower population, because of a number of the other areas, less political voice in the system as well, they are likely to face fiscal discrimination, which basically means that they are unlikely to see a larger pool of the resources that the state has. Furthermore, their ability to influence decision-making is also extremely low, which means that there is likely to be discontent as far as these peripheral regions are concerned, because of a lack of political voice, because of a lack of political participation within the overall nation-state system. Infrastructure in these parts of the world, once again, because there are likely to be fiscal constraints, which basically means that spending or public sector spending, both in education, in public services, as well as the broader infrastructure, is likely to be lower as well. Furthermore, there are likely to be these spatial inequalities, the literature argues, are not produced at point zero. There's a long history of why and how this precarity and this sort of peripherality is produced within these nation states. So in the case of West and East Germany, there's a long history of why this sort of how East Germany in many cases became a periphery as far as the German nation state is concerned. Now, as far as the mainstream view on these internal peripheries is concerned, the onus or the focus very much is on the fact that these areas are backward, and there is a temporal lag between these parts of the country, between these parts of the nation state, and the rest of the country. So therefore, there needs to be a national effort, or there needs to be a focus on actually bringing these people out of the cultural and economic backwardness that they face. There is some interesting work, it's dated, but there's some interesting work on internal peripheries as far as South Asia is concerned. There's a wonderful paper that was written by Kirk in 1981, which sort of argues that under colonialism as well, there's a dual structure as far as that existed in the Indian subcontinent. Of course, there was no Pakistan or Bangladesh at that point in time. And Kirk argues that even at that point in time, you had some regions, he highlights, or he talks about 14 core regions within South Asia at that point in time. He includes Burma or Myanmar into that as well, which formed the core as far as the South Asia or subcontinent is concerned, or the broader South Asian region is concerned. And the rest of the country was, or the rest of the subcontinent was peripheral to this core, because the core had industry, the core had commerce and trade, the core had modern enterprises, the core had agricultural activity. So it was a much more sort of a productive part of the empire as compared to the peripheral regions, which were far behind as far as economic development was concerned. And you could see these sort of core peripheral regions across different parts of South Asia during in the period after independence as well. So Kirk argues that even though there have been some efforts by central governments to centralize planning. Centralized planning was pretty much the way to do it in 1981 in India, but also in Pakistan and in Bangladesh as well, which of course gained independence in 1971. But there were efforts to reduce these social inequalities, especially by spending on infrastructure. However, there was those sort of structural inequalities remained very much a part of the whole structure as far as South Asia is concerned. And he talks about India, he talks about Pakistan, and a little bit about Bangladesh as well. And he uses a very interesting term, which is the periphery of the periphery. And he argues that towards the east of India, you have peripheral regions. But if you go towards the northeast, these areas are actually the peripheries of the peripheries as well. So when I think about Gwadar and when I think about Balochistan and Pakistan, I think about Gwadar very much as a periphery of the periphery, and I'll come to the reasons that I think so as well. Another problem that Kirk identifies is that there is that while there were multiple plans that the nation states came up with across South Asia, converting, as many of the people who work on South Asia know, converting those plans into actual realities is extremely problematic. So while on paper you might say, oh, we spent X amount of money to, build X amount of schools or X number of schools in this particular, for example, Bihar, but the actual money that goes on the ground is likely to be really limited because of a number of different reasons. So state capacity, even at that point in time, remains a major problem as far as the internal peripheries within South Asia are concerned. There is also a nascent literature on internal peripheries within Pakistan as well. And there's a very interesting book chapter by Bozas, which talks about how peripheral regions, Bozas studies the Gilgit-Baltistan region, which is in the northern part of Pakistan, which is disputed territory between India and Pakistan, where Bozas says that over time, these peripheral regions are seen as state assets because of the natural resources that are embodied in these places and the strategic importance that these areas have. The nation state within Pakistan has started looking at these as strategic assets. So in the case of Gilgit-Baltistan, for example, you've got all this hydropower or all the sort of dams that are being constructed in these, or the potential to generate energy, electricity. So that area is extremely important, of course, because it borders India as well, and there's been a long simmering conflict. So therefore, the strategic importance of that area is there. Over time, in the Pakistani state has tried to further its territorial control over these peripheral regions as well. So Akhtar, in a 2007 paper in looking at Balochistan and its relationship with Pakistan, argues how the quest for natural resources and a state-led project to exploit natural resources within Balochistan has led to this quest to have a more stable presence of, or a greater control over areas that are part of Balochistan as well. And David Harvey talks about how this is, or terms this as accumulation by dispossession, as a spatial temporal sort of a event. It's sort of the state sort of wants to extract natural resources and sort of take over many of these natural resources, which they did not control before that as well. There, another paper, again, after 2022, talks about how there is that extractive logic remains extremely strong over the last decade and a half, and the state represses ethnic peripheries, and Akhtar looks at two ethnic peripheries in particular, the Baluch in Balochistan and the Pakhtuns in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, who have been a part of the war on terrorism, since eons. So the state repression has been an important, very important part of this sort of the literature as far as internal peripheries is concerned. There's also this notion how infrastructure is important. So the Pakistani state has created this this discourse, public discourse, about how there are people, or there are certain races. So there's this racialized version of an internal periphery where some people in peripheral regions such as Balochistan, for example, do not want development. So there's this trope which is extremely strong as far as the settled or the core areas in the Punjab are concerned, that the Baloch are backward and they do not want progress and they do not want infrastructure, whereas the Pakistani state has created this whole discourse of how it was much more stronger under Musharraf. It's changed a little bit since then, about how there are people within the peripheries who do not want change and who want to remain backward, and these are spaces of backwardness. So Bozas argues that peripheralization is not natural, although one can argue looking at longer duration of how these sort of these logics of core periphery worked under the British, but it is a result of state policy which entrenched these peripheralities within the nation state in Pakistan. Which brings us to the first part of our case study, which is Balochistan. So I'll just talk about the context of Balochistan and its tenuous relationship with the state in Pakistan. So Balochistan has the largest land area of any province in Pakistan. It covers around 43% of Pakistan's total land area. However, in terms of population, Balochistan is the most sparsely populated part of the federation. It is an ethnically diverse despite the fact that it's sparsely populated, it's quite ethnically diverse. So there are a number of different, races or groups that live in Balochistan. These include the Baloch, the Pakhtun, Brahui, Hazaras, who's settled from Afghanistan, and then settlers from the rest of the country as well, including Muhajirs who came from India, as well as Punjabi. And there's a long history of marginalization that Balochistan has faced within the federation as well. The other point which is important and which ties into our earlier discussion is that Balochistan is very rich in mineral resources. Earlier it was natural gas, now there's copper, there's iron ore, there is gold. So it's a very, very rich area in terms of natural resources, which makes it important for the state, as I mentioned earlier, to sort of solidify its control over this area. Now, if I take your mind back to the earlier discussion that we had regarding the lack of political voice or the lack of political representation, we can see that in this particular figure as well. This is a division of the number of seats by provinces in the National Assembly. So if you see over here, the middle column, that's the Punjab. And the Punjab, because of the fact that in terms of population, it's almost more than half of it's more than half actually, of the population of Pakistan. It has 180 odd seats. Sindh, again, important. Khyber Pakhtunkhwa is important as well. It's going to become more important because FATA has been merged into it as well. But if we see Balochistan, which is the first column, you can see that the number of seats that Balochistan has in the National Assembly is only 16. Out of a total of 340 odd seats, only 16 National Assembly constituencies are based in Balochistan. So that brings us to the second point, which is political representation and political voice. Because Balochistan has such a limited voice, Baloch representatives do not get the same sort of importance as far as the national body politic is concerned as, for example, Punjab. So there's a saying in Pakistan, there's election season coming, that whoever controls Pakistan, Punjab controls Pakistan. And you can see that in this particular figure, because if you have 180 odd seats, you basically don't need Sindh, you do not need KPK, you do not need Balochistan. Balochistan especially. Where Balochistan becomes important is when you have a hung parliament. So if you've got a hung parliament, then Baloch seats become much more important. And the leader of one of these, parties which is now aligned with this government, it was aligned with the previous government as well, said this on national television, that you only think about the Baloch votes when there's a hung parliament. It's then that we become important as far as the political system is concerned. Apart from that, Balochistan is very marginal to the national politics within Pakistan. Furthermore, as I said, there's a history of marginalization. There's also a history of top-down resource management within the Pakistani state as well. So we talked about political representation, but if we also look at the civil military bureaucracy, which is once again very important as far as Pakistan is concerned, especially the military part of it, Balochistan has very low representation within the military. There are new studies haven't really come in. There's a 2010 study by Fair and Pasha that sort of talks about how within the officer corps, there are hardly any Baloch officers at all. Similar is the case with the civilian bureaucracy. If you look at the federal secretaries, which is the top rank that you can reach as far as the civilian bureaucracy is concerned, you would find very few officers from Balochistan. And the number of officers that actually get inducted to the civil services from Balochistan is very low because it's based on population once again. As I said, the relationship with the state, with the core state, has been very tenuous. And Akhtar in the 2000 paper argues how the conflict between Balochistan and federal government is the most persistent core province, sort of contradiction that exists in Pakistan. So that's the way that scholars have looked at this relationship. And we can see once again why that's so. There have been multiple ongoing, multiple instances of insurgencies that have taken place in Balochistan. And it started right in 1948 when the Khan of Kalat was forced to accede to the Pakistani state. The Pakistani state sent in the military, and it was under duress. It's argued in the literature that the Khan of Kalat acceded to Pakistan. But that wasn't the end of it. These sort of insurgencies continued, and they've been there both under military rule, which is martial law, and in times of civilian rule as well. So for example, this period of 1973 to 1977 was a civilian interlude where Zulfikar Ali Bhutto ruled Pakistan. And he sent the army in. He dismissed the elected government in Balochistan, and he sent the army in 1974, if I'm not wrong. And the fifth Baloch insurgency, which is this current wave, has been going on from 2004, and it is still ongoing. Low-level conflict, but it's still ongoing. And it's passed through all three different types of regimes. It includes martial law. Musharraf was in power when it started. Civilian rule from 2008 through to 2017. And then the hybrid regime of Imran Khan. So under all of these three political dispensations, this low-level, this low-level conflict or low-level insurgency has been ongoing. And there are different reasons for that, for this sort of violence. One, I've already talked about, that there are questions about provincial autonomy. There's a high level of centralization, or there's traditionally been a high level of centralization as far as the Pakistani state is concerned, and that stoked, these sort of voices that we're not getting our due share as far as Pakistan's concerned. Furthermore, mega development projects have further, enhanced this insecurity within Balochistan as well. So, for example, when Gwadar port was launched, the argument that the state made very much was that this is for Balochistan and Balochistan is going to gain from it. However, if you talk to people in Balochistan, they argued that because population in Balochistan is low, so with the growth of Gwadar and with the port and all of the economic activity that's going to come in, the Baloch are unlikely to take advantage of it, and it's the other people who are going to move into their areas who are going to take advantage of whatever benefits Gwadar brings, which is another the sort of underlying reason for it, which once again I discussed earlier. The structural feature behind it is that because spending on education has been really low, so therefore it's for sort of furthers this focus that core areas from the Punjab, from Karachi, more educated people are likely to take more advantage of the opportunities that the project is going to bring. And of course, there have been various authors such as Samad 2015 who argue that at the core, the problem in Balochistan is a political one, and the Pakistani state has been trying to deal with it or come up with a military solution, and that military solution is not going to work. Now, one of the main sort of reasons that Baloch, people who are part of the insurgency make, and others who are sympathetic to it as well, is that the resources that Balochistan has, the Baloch have not been able to take advantage of it. And one of the emblematic, conflicts is over natural gas, which was produced in a town called Sui in Dera Bukti. I'll show you the map as well. And there are three major issues that are highlighted in the literature. One is the pricing of natural gas. The other one is the inequitable use of these resources. And the third one is the lack of spending within the borders of Balochistan as well. So natural gas reserves were discovered in Balochistan in 1952, and Karachi, being the national capital and the most important industrial city, was connected to these newly discovered reserves in 1952. And by 2010, a substantial portion of the total natural gas which is used in Pakistan comes from Balochistan, around 30 odd percent. It's gone lower, but it's still quite substantial. So during this period of time from 1954 to 2019, 71 trillion cubic feet of gas have actually been used from Balochistan. However, in terms of consumption, only 9 to 10% of natural gas has been consumed in Balochistan. If you look at what portion of Balochistan's landmass is actually connected to the grid or the pipeline that sort of provides gas, only 6% of the province's population has access to this natural resources and has access to natural gas. So let's put this into perspective. Natural gas was discovered in Balochistan in 1952, the largest reserves in Pakistan. But by 2021, only 6% of the population in Balochistan had access to piped natural gas. So this sort of puts the views that the Baloch have regarding natural resources into perspective as well. And as I said, since then, we've had copper discovered, we've had gold discovered, we've got Gwadar becoming a really important, sort of a geopolitical symbol. So those sort of notions of being exploited are historically driven. And of course, there was centralization. And even though soy gas has played a very important role as far as agriculture and industrialization is concerned, however, in terms of royalty, in terms of returns, it's been largely limited. Now let's come to Gwadar. So we talked about the core, which is the Pakistani state. We talked about the periphery within the Pakistan, which is Balochistan, and its relationship with the core. And now we come to Gwadar. Gwadar is really interesting. Gwadar, much of the literature, once again, on Gwadar sort of approaches the problem from a geopolitical angle. It's as if there are no people living in Gwadar. It's only a dot on the map. And it's all geopolitics driven by Islamabad, driven by Beijing, driven by Washington. And that's the only thing that becomes important as far as the calculus is concerned. Gwadar was, for a large portion of the last 200 years, was ruled by the Sultanate of Oman. It's a very interesting story. You find these stories in many different parts of the world where the British, in their infinite wisdom, handed over a part of the world to someone and then, sort of left it there. But Gwadar was a primarily fishing town, and it was part of a larger Indian Ocean network. So once again, this is very interesting that Gwadar was outward looking. So it was part, or it saw itself part of a wider Indian Ocean sort of a civilization rather than inward looking towards the rest of the subcontinent. And that, of course, has changed over time. However, it was part of this larger, sort of commercial empire. I'm sure Kansan knows much more about this than me. However, it was part of a broader or a much bigger Indian Ocean, sort of a empire or civilization before it became a part of Pakistan. In 1958, the Pakistani state purchased Gwadar from the Sultan of Oman. I think they paid around $8 odd million. And they purchased Gwadar, and Gwadar became a part of Pakistan. Now, even at that point in time, Gwadar, if you look at that, and I'll just show you the map in a little bit, was strategically or seen as being strategically important. And as far as the Pakistani state was concerned, both civilians as well as the military government, especially after the 1990s, saw this as being strategically important. It was right at the mouth of the Strait of Hormuz. And because such a large portion of energy flows through the Strait of Hormuz, so therefore Gwadar being so close to the world's energy supply lines became all the more important. And the idea was that Gwadar, given its privileged location as far as the Indian Ocean was concerned, would enhance the state's military as well as economic clout, both in the Middle East as well as in Southeast Asia. But of course, they didn't have the money to construct this port over there. So this is our case study. This is Balochistan. The earlier discussion that I was having about Sui is this town, Dera Bukti, which is towards the northeast of Balochistan. But we're like right now looking at Gwadar. I'm really sorry for the map. It should have showed the Indian Ocean as well. However, Gwadar is along the Makran coast and it borders Iran towards the west. Now, the Pakistani state, as I said, has been trying to construct something in Gwadar at least since the 1990s, but because the state is perpetually constrained fiscally, so they do not have the money to actually do this. And in 2002, the Chinese entered and they, started, or they promised funding. They actually promised funding in 2001, but because of 9/11, things got delayed. And construction work on the port finally started in 2002 with Chinese funding, and a Chinese firm was shortlisted to construct the port as well. Now, the first phase of the port was constructed all the way back in 2007. However, surprisingly, none of the Chinese firms, none of the Chinese port operators actually bid on controlling the port. And control of the port was handed over to the Singapore Port Authority or Port of Singapore Authority in 2007. Singapore SP or PSA withdrew in 2012. Now, the argument that the Pakistani state makes is that they did not fulfill their promises as far as developing Gwadar port is concerned. However, there's a flip side to it as well. Bonnie 2019 argues that on their side, the PSA argue that the promised land that they were supposed to receive in order to develop the allied infrastructure as far as the port was concerned was never handed over to them and was actually under the control of various entities within the Pakistani state, with various powerful actors within the Pakistani state. So in 2012, before the launch of the Belt and Road Initiative, operations of the Gwadar port were handed over to China Overseas Port Holding Company. It's a firm that's registered in Hong Kong. It's not one of the larger Chinese port operators, which is surprising. However, there's some suggestion that COPHC is linked to China Communication Corporation companies, China CCCCC, yes, 4 Cs. And there was an agreement in 2012 whereby revenue sharing, 91% of the revenue would go to COPHC as the port operator, and only 9% of the revenue would go to the government of Pakistan. Again, what's interesting as far as the revenue sharing is not the lopsided deal alone, but it's also the fact that the Balochistan government, which is the actual sort of area where the port is located, did not receive anything as far as this revenue sharing was concerned. And there was a lot of hue and cry within the popular press, but the hue and cry was on the 91% rather than the 9%. So it was more on how China has taken a large part of the cake as far as Gwadar is concerned, because at that time there were hopes that Gwadar would, be the next big thing as far as ports are concerned. That did not happen. So COPHC is actually still not probably making money. And then we come to 2015 when the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor was launched. And Gwadar once again becomes big news as far as the Belt and Road Initiative is concerned, because it is the southwesterly terminus of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. If we look at the original hopes and wishes on CPEC, there were all these, sort of schemes where Gwadar would link with Western China, Xinjiang, especially Kashgar, through multimodal, transportation linkages. These would include roads, these would include railways, and they would also include pipelines. And the argument very much was that given the dilemmas that China faces in the South China Sea, so therefore here is an alternate where which is located close to the supply of natural resources, or one of the most busiest shipping lines as far as natural resources are concerned. And given that China is strategically, is sort of exposed in the South China Sea, where there are all these conflicts. The Chinese could develop this area as an alternate supply route for meeting their energy needs. But of course, it's extremely expensive to do that, given the geographical, difficulties of the difficult terrain that you pass through. Developing Gwadar port and city becomes an integral part of the China-Pakistan economic corridor. It becomes one of the main areas as far of cooperation, and both governments establish a joint working group. So when Pakistan and China started working on CPEC in 2013, one of the interesting views, which once again is not really covered in the literature that much, is that there was a quick institutionalization of decision-making. So there are joint working groups on different parts of CPEC. And one of those joint working groups is on Gwadar, which brings together bureaucrats and sometimes policymakers from both sides, and they take decisions on various projects. And basically the idea very much was that we're going to promote social change, and we're going to bring about regional economic development, not only in Gwadar, but also in the rest of Balochistan, by investing in infrastructure. And the port is a very central part of that infrastructure. And this catches on. This whole notion of Gwadar as, the next big thing as far as Pakistan's concerned, catches on really quickly. So my interviews in 2019, very senior people, politicians argue that CPEC, that's the flagship as far as the Belt and Road Initiative is concerned. And within CPEC, Gwadar is the cheese as far as CPEC is concerned. And the language that's used to, talk about Gwadar is very interesting. For example, another interview talked about how the sort of Gwadar is the pivot around which CPEC, revolves. And of course, the BRI is revolves around Pakistan and CPEC being the pilot project as far as the BRI is concerned. There are also talks about how Gwadar is going to become green, it's going to become sustainable, and a modern city. And there is a need to connect Gwadar to the rest of Balochistan. The Gwadar Free Zone, which is the first phase, has been built, but the idea that there's going to be this industrial zone in Gwadar, the sort of feelings of euphoria were immense, where Gwadar would emerge as the next Shanghai. So as the idea was that the learnings that the Chinese had from Shanghai, from the free zones that are developed in Shanghai, you would transplant those learnings somehow in the case of Gwadar, which is located in southwestern Pakistan, and Gwadar would become the next Shanghai, and it would become a game changer for Balochistan and for the rest of Pakistan. There were also hopes that there would be regional integration, as well as trade from Afghanistan and Central Asian republics would flow through Gwadar port as well. And this point is really interesting. So when I talk to people in Islamabad, they're clear about the fact that the radiation zone of the port is not towards Pakistan. So it's not meant to handle traffic, port traffic from Pakistan, because you've got two functioning ports in Karachi. There's the Port Qasim and then there's the Karachi port. They argue that the radiation zone for this particular port is geared towards the Chinese market, but before the Chinese transit trade, it's geared towards trade from Central Asian republics, my apologies, and from Afghanistan, because the cars are landlocked. So therefore, the argument is that you can actually provide a trade route for them through Gwadar, which is much quicker, which is much easier for them, and it's less costly as well. But the elephant in the room is, of course, Afghanistan, because they have to pass through Afghanistan in order to get to Pakistan, and stability in Afghanistan is still questionable. And this is the sort of linkage as far as this whole imaginary of highways connecting Gwadar to the rest of the country are concerned. Gwadar is, of course, right, this anvil that's jutting out towards the bottom left of the picture, and it is going to connect through the rest of the country through these networks of motorways. which pass through the east, the west, and the center of the country. And if you look at the top of the picture, they're going to connect to Kashgar and to China. And these are pictures from my fieldwork in Balochistan, in Gwadar as well. On the left, you can see the Gwadar International Airport, the old Gwadar International Airport. Of course, the Chinese are building it. On the right, you can see some pictures of the port area. And this on the left is once again very interesting because this is a swanky new business center that's been built by COPHC in the middle of Gwadar. It's a sight to see because there is not, I mean, you have the port around it, but there's absolutely nothing in scale that matches to this building in Gwadar. And in the lobby of that swanky new building is this map, which shows China, the big brother, and then Pakistan, sort of there as equal partners, despite the scalar differences between the two countries as well. On the right, you've got pictures of the port. Even in 2019, when I had the opportunity to go there, there was very little traffic. This is a nighttime view of the port as well. The city is towards the left of this picture, and after the port is the sea. Okay. So we've talked about the peripherality of Balochistan. We've talked about the peripherality of Gwadar as well. And now I'd like to discuss this notion of outsourced development, which we are trying to develop, which we're trying to sort of make in this paper as well. The argument is that all of the planning, all of the infrastructure, and all of the social welfare projects that have been undertaken in Gwadar at this point in time, they've been funded and executed by Chinese firms in Gwadar. Of course, the official pointed that it is in partnership with the host government, but the Chinese state, actually Chinese firms, especially Chinese state-owned enterprises, have taken on many of the functions that normally states undertake within their national borders as well. And there are a number of examples of this. For example, the Gwadar Master Plan. The Gwadar Master Plan was jointly developed between the Gwadar Development Authority and China Harbor Engineering and Design Institute, which is a part of China Communications Construction Company Limited. But in essence, when you talk to people, most of the work as far as the master plan of the city is concerned was undertaken by the Harbor Engineering and Design Institute. And there are a number of reasons for it. Number one, the funding came from the Chinese state, so through a grant. Again, for those of you who study the BRI, the number of projects that are funded through grants and through interest-free loans in the case of Gwadar alone are very interesting. So there's definitely something that's happening over here. But the other problem is that the human capital in the peripheries. So once again, I take your mind back to the discussion we had on internal peripheries. The human capital that you have in internal peripheries is usually not, because of different constraints, you do not have the same quality of human capital. So therefore, the planning of Gwadar Master Plan, even though ostensibly it's between the two countries, the Chinese were definitely the China Harbor Engineering and Design Institute researchers were definitely in the driving seat as far as this project was concerned. Similar is the case with the new Gwadar International Airport. I showed you the small airport. There's a new airport which is being built in Gwadar with Chinese money, once again grant funded, and it is to be the largest airport in the country. So let's put things into perspective. Gwadar has a population of 200,000 people. Karachi has a population of around 10 to 12 million people. Lahore has a population of between 9 to 11 million people. Islamabad has a population of around 4 to 5 million people, depending on which estimates you look at. So the largest airport in Pakistan is not being constructed in any of these cities. It's actually being constructed in Gwadar with grants from the Chinese. The East Bay Expressway, which is another large, not very large, but it's sort of very important as far as the operationalization of Gwadar port is concerned. Once again, this has been funded. This is being constructed by a Chinese state-owned enterprise, and this has been constructed through an interest-free loan as well, because without this expressway, the functioning of the port is problematic because traffic has to pass through the rest of the city. And it's, of course, an old city, dilapidated infrastructure, etc. But once again, it's being funded by the Chinese through an interest-free loan. The free zone that's being built by the China Overseas Port Holding Company, and the resources to build that free zone are being expended by the firm as well. The first phase of that free zone, by the way, has been completed. It's a pilot project. So apparently there are 4 firms that have started operations in the free zone, but I haven't been there, so I'm not really sure if they've actually started operations there. But COPHC is now going to build a much bigger free zone next to this pilot project as well. The Pakistani state, it's given land, it's given tax breaks, but it's not really contributed anything in material terms, right? So it's given the land, it's given some tax break, it's given concessions, actually quite substantial tax breaks. However, the money to build this free zone, as far as I understand, is coming from COPHC. And a number of other projects which are, so these are the economic ones. If you look at the social sector as well, a number of projects are being funded by the Chinese. Once again, interestingly, by Chinese state-owned enterprise. If we look at public funding, so if we buy the argument that Gwadar is the next big thing and Pakistani state, the politicians, the civil military bureaucracy, accept that it's the next best thing, then one would expect that as far as Pakistan's national planning budget is concerned, a large portion of that goes towards Gwadar in order to develop the allied infrastructure. That's not happened. Gwadar has not received a larger portion of the national budget. Gwadar has not received a larger portion of the Balochistan budget as well. And that's where this notion of periphery of the peripheries comes into play as well, because of course, Balochistan is its own internal political economy. Gwadar, in terms of the social setup, is very different from the rest of Baloch society. And I'm talking about Baloch society alone. You have Pakhtuns in Balochistan as well, who have their own separate social structure. So the political acceptability of funding, public sector funding, or increasing public sector funding for Gwadar remains tenuous. So therefore, you have all of these external actors, especially the Chinese state actors that I'm talking about, coming in and spending money. So for example, this China-Pakistan Vocational and Technical Institute, which is built, once again, the Chinese built some fabulous buildings very quickly. It's a swanky new building as well. That's been constructed by CHEC, which, as I said, is a subsidiary of CCCC. A large hospital is being funded by the Chinese, and it's, again, grant funded. Desalination plants, once again, are being built and they're being funded by the Chinese as well. So once again, those functions that you would normally think that the state would take over, they are being funded by the Chinese state and undertaken by Chinese state-owned enterprises. But there are limits to this model of outsourced development, and the Chinese state-owned enterprises are increasingly seeing the limits of this outsourced development. Despite all of the money that they've put in, despite all of the resources that they've put in, there is one thing that the Chinese actors lack as far as Gwadar is concerned, and that is sovereignty. It still remains within the territorial boundaries of Pakistan, even though, as I said, it's peripheral as far as the Pakistani mainland is concerned, or this development imaginary is concerned, apart from these tropes of, game changer, etc. It's still governed by Pakistani laws. And even though all of the investment has been made, or all of this money has come in from Chinese state-owned enterprises and Chinese actors, their ability to control things is largely limited. Their ability to push through what they want to do is largely limited, even though we find that there's a large body of literature which says that basically, China goes into all of these countries, it does what it wants, and the locals are basically, sort of pushovers. That's not the way that it works. The Chinese within these places, even in a heavily securitized environment like Gwadar, need to work with and need to work through multiple power centers and local stakeholders. The civil and military bureaucracy, especially the military bureaucracy, is the most important one. But there's a large number of, or there has been a growth of a number of state organizations that are now working on Balochistan. My co-author actually, sort of prepared a list of all of those institutions that we need to talk to, and it's mind-boggling. The number of provincial, ministries that are involved in Gwadar, the number of local, organizations that are involved in Gwadar, the number of federal government institutions or organizations that are involved in Balochistan. So as a Chinese actor, there's no one-stop shop that you can talk to. So the JWG is there. But when it comes to working on the ground, you've got to work through all of these local stakeholders and, sort of face a number of different delays when working on these projects. And of course, the notion is that you enhance the control of the state. And then you've got to work with local sensibilities as well. There are very strong feelings of alienation as far as the local population is concerned. Chinese firms do not have access to land. There are continuing questions over who controls land. After 2002, there was a real estate bonanza in Balochistan, and anyone who studies Pakistan and Pakistan's economy knows that real estate is the go-to thing as far as investment is concerned. And after 2002, private investors, speculators, thronged in Gwadar. They control a lot of the land. Powerful organizations also control quite a bit of the land as well. And getting control of this land for these free zones, for industrial zones, for all of these wonderful things that the Chinese want to build is problematic. And it requires a number of different levers being pulled as well. And last but not the least, there are persistent security challenges. So I talked about how there is a low-level insurgency that's ongoing in Balochistan. The Chinese have been targeted in other parts of Pakistan. In Sindh, there have been attacks in Balochistan, in Gwadar proper as well. So there are multiple security challenges that are faced by the Chinese. And I'll finish the presentation by asking this question about development for whom. I've already talked about how the local populations within internal peripheries are marginalized, and we see this happening in the case of Balochistan, in the case of Gwadar as well. The local community is increasingly marginalized, and they are seen as far as the popular Pakistani sort of perception is concerned as being anti-development and being backward. There is a focus on increasing securitization in Balochistan, in Gwadar, especially across Balochistan, but also especially in Gwadar. There were moves to fence the port and the free zone off from the rest of the city. They did not work. There's a lack of social sector spending, as I've already talked about, and there have been despite all of the securitization, etc., there have been popular protests in Gwadar. There was one in November as well, and there are questions over livelihood. And this just puts things into perspective a little bit as well. So Balochistan, and the last column is Gwadar, and we can see how from 1998 to 2017, despite the fact that this is the golden period, CPEC is launched, etc., 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 growth rates in Gwadar are low as compared to even Balochistan. If you look at incidence of poverty, which is the second column, these are dated, my apologies, but they're based on official statistics. That's the best that we have. There's a paucity of data. We find that in Gwadar, incidence of poverty is actually higher than Balochistan. And it is significantly higher than the rest of the country as well. And of course, we can put things into perspective with Balochistan as well. As I said, water supply remains limited. Desalination plants, the Pakistani state was supposed to put in desalination plants because it's an arid region, it's a desert region. Water remains a perpetual problem. I've been told that it's gotten better because there have been rains. However, water supply remains limited. Electricity, which is such an important part as far as all of these plans around free zones, etc., are concerned, remains a problem. Electricity at this point in time across Makran, which Gwadar is a part of, is imported from Iran. And it's not as if they import thousands of megawatts of electricity from Iran. It's very limited. There are frequent brownouts of load shedding, as it's called in Pakistan. There have been plans to construct power plant by CCCC. Since 2015, they've not happened, and now those plans have been shelved, and the Pakistanis, given the fiscal problems that they face, they now want the Chinese to fund a transmission line from Sindh to Balochistan. But of course, there are many problems. The time is a problem, cost is a problem, of course, security remains a problem as well. And the question is that if you want all of these free zone or this Chinese reinvestment, as the Pakistanis keep talking about, to come to these free zones, how is it going to happen in the absence of energy? And as the interview shows, there's no water, there's no electricity, local people feel alienated. Real estate remains a part of, capital accumulation, and the free zone and the port and the master plan, despite, being developed, I've been told that it's world class, it doesn't really take on board local sensibilities. So those questions of development for whom come to the fore when we look at Gwadar as a place with people living there, rather than just a dot on the map which has geopolitical significance. And I'll end my presentation with this image, which is striking. This is in Gwadar. This is from last year, and a beautiful new cricket stadium has been built in Gwadar. And this, if you can see around it, there's a sea of aridity and the desert. And within that, you have this beautiful green space superimposed. The first match in this particular cricket stadium was played in 2021. And all of the players, interestingly, were flown out from Islamabad. This included the British High Commissioner as well, and politicians and notable. What was missing was local people in Balochistan. So I'll just end my presentation. I hope I'm on time, Bhagya. I'm actually over, so my apologies for that. But I'll end with that thought, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tayyab. That was a really, really interesting presentation. I think there's a lot of questions that I would personally want to ask you, and I'm sure that it's the same for our audience from around the world listening in on this curious case of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, one of the biggest projects China is involved in, and like you mentioned, the crown jewel of the Belt and Road Initiative. So just to get things rolling, I like I said, I have a million questions for you. I would probably get hold of you personally as well and talk to you more at length about this. But you said something very, very interesting right towards the end. You mentioned about the energy problems in Gwadar. Now, as far as I know, the CPEC has plenty of energy generation projects, coal power plants that have come up. Some are already operational. So I'm curious as to whether any of these projects will eventually maybe provide energy to Gwadar. Is that something that's in the pipeline? Why is it that energy is coming in from Iran?
It's a great question, Bhagya. Again, so because Balochistan is sparsely populated, so therefore the infrastructure to get the line across, the transmission line across is quite costly. And as I said, geographically as well, it's on the border, it's peripheral. So therefore, there's no grid as such from the Pakistani side, as far as I understand, going to Gwadar. So that's why electricity comes through, because it's less costly to bring it through Iran. The plan was to construct a 330 megawatt power plant based on imported coal. CCCC would have done this. The plan's been there since 2015. It was there in 2018-19 when I did my field work. It was there until 2021. We've just read that it's now the Pakistanis, given the fact that it's based on imported coal and they don't have, they're fiscally constrained. So they don't want to spend money on imported coal. They want to either convert the project to local coal or they want to build a transmission line from these already existing power plants through to Gwadar. And that's what they proposed to the Chinese. I don't think if that's going to, I don't know if that's been accepted by the Chinese or not. But as I said, clearly looking at the scale of things that are happening in Gwadar, the Chinese, I mean, many people in Pakistan are very keen to say that the Chinese know what they're doing, even though most of the literature shows that it's, it's a piecemeal sort of a thing. But apparently, that's the plan, that you're going to connect the power plants that have already been built, for example, in Sindh, and you're going to take the transmission line to Gwadar. As I said, that's costly, that's time consuming, and there are lots of security issues as well to building that new transmission line.
Lots of security issues. Interesting. I would like to remind our audience to submit their questions to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We have Dr. Tayyab Safdar with us today, and I'm sure you have plenty of questions to asking about the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor and its involvement in the Belt and Road Initiative. So we have some questions coming in. One of these is asking you to talk a little bit more about the protests against the Chinese and BRI in Gwadar. This is also something I was thinking that we've heard a lot about, the suicide attacks on hotels. You've also mentioned how these are widespread and that these are challenges. So could you talk about how these challenges, these protests affect the success of both the CPEC and the Belt and Road Initiative?
Yes, that is a great question. So, so the port was built in 2007, right? And I've talked about how, there was this whole notion that, things are going to become better, you're going to have investment, etc., etc. That's sadly not taken place as far as Gwadar is concerned. It's been 15 years since the port was built, partly operational. Actually 2007, yes, 15 years. But nothing's happened. And I've also talked about how, basic public services are not available. Access to healthcare, access to water, access to education even. So if you look at the Balochistan development statistics, I didn't make it a part of the presentation, but the number of primary schools that are operational in Gwadar has actually gone down. So these are public-owned schools. And at the same time, a large portion of the population is fisher folk. So fishing is the way that they, sort of make their livelihoods, and their ability to, sustain their livelihoods is under increasing threats. This is not only due to the port and security concerns, but this is also due to illegal fishing by ships from neighboring Sindh provinces, from the neighboring Sindh province, but also further afield, large Chinese fishing vessels have also, encroached on these livelihoods as well. So, I mean, it's not a protest purely against the Chinese. I think it's mischaracterized as far as the popular media is concerned. It is a protest against the lack of services, the lack of access to, these basic public services within Gwadar, despite years of promise. It's also a protest against the high level of securitization that's taken place in Gwadar. And thirdly, it's a protest against the destruction of livelihoods within this part of the world. So I don't think that it's the way that it's characterized as a demonstration against CPEC and the BRI. I think it's a much broader sort of alienation that's there as far as residents of Gwadar are concerned. And I don't think that it's so. It sort of raises questions. This question raises questions about the overall character of the Pakistani state and its relationship with its peripheries as well, as I talked about it. So securitization is just one aspect of the state enforcing its territorial control over this. But sadly speaking, that's been the strongest one, right? So the lack of public services, the lack of access to education, health, water, etc., 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 they've been pushed to the back burner. The Chinese are the ones who are funding these projects. The Pakistani state isn't funding a lot of them. They're funding some, so they built a university, etc., but they're not funding a lot of them. So the whole focus of the Pakistani state is on securitizing, is on ensuring that the model of development that's become a part of it, for example, real estate, that becomes securitized. So people feel alienated with this whole notion of development as far as Gwadar is concerned. What it means for CPEC and for the BRI is actually interesting because, as I said, and there's no answer to it because, as I said, there's a local political economy, there's a domestic political economy that the BRI and these grandiose projects like CPEC need to contend with. And how they interact with the projects is sort of still, we're still trying to understand how it works.
Interesting that you mentioned that some of these issues are securitized by the government. I think this is also something we see in Sri Lanka, where some of the basic issues, like you said, healthcare, education, they are pushed to the corner. And sometimes when certain issues come up, the state tends to securitize it as opposed to actually addressing the issues. So we have a question coming in from Sri Lanka, interestingly, asking whether you could explain how Pakistan is going to handle the resistance in Balochistan and the development of the Chabahar port by India.
I must confess, I'm not an international relations person. So as I meander through my response, please take it with a pinch of salt. So as far as dealing with the insurgency is concerned, there have been various efforts by different political actors to, sort of look for a political solution. The resistance or the insurgency has become much more, amorphous, and it's become much more decentralized. So you will not have probably large-scale issues, but you will have these small-scale attacks that are there that are meant to generate fear, right? So these attacks are not going to, sort of dissuade the Pakistan army in any way, but they're there to generate fear. So these attacks on the Chinese, for example, these softer targets are meant to generate fear as far as Pakistan's concerned, and to dissuade the Chinese from actually coming to Pakistan and investing in Gwadar because of whatever real or imaginary grievances there might be. Now, as far as the Chabahar issue is concerned, that's a very interesting question because the Iranians, despite all of the problems that they've had, seem to have built some of the allied infrastructure that is required to make Chabahar operational. For example, there's a functioning railway line that connects all the way to the Central Asian states as well. I think that the Indians have, over the last few years, they've not invested as much as they thought they would because of sanctions and other problems, that these firms are likely to face. And Chabahar and Gwadar apparently are sister ports now. So I think the idea is that there has to be a coexistence. One, I think the Pakistanis are comfortable in the fact, or the Pakistani establishment is comfortable in the fact that there's not going to be military presence as far as the Indians are concerned in Chabahar. And they're also comfortable about the fact that the relationship between China and the rest of the world is going to remain between Iran and the rest of the world, with the sanctions, etc., are going to remain problematic. So Gwadar, if it becomes functional, would still be able to attract some of the traffic. So I think that whole notion of it being, a competition or competitive has become lower, especially now that the Indians aren't really investing a lot of money as far as Chabahar is concerned.
Interesting. So we see the Chinese coming in and investing more comparatively, I guess, speaking.
And Iran is, Iran is one of the main, recipients of Chinese goods, Chinese money as well.
So you mentioned that there's very little development and infrastructure in Gwadar, that you see these one-off constructions like the cricket stadium, this building, this huge building you were talking about. This is also something we see in Sri Lanka, Tayyab, that there are these, one-off buildings that don't necessarily contribute to the development of the region. We also have a question about bargaining in terms of whether the Pakistan government is actually trying to negotiate anything with the Chinese about this development project. What is Pakistan's take, and how will Gwadar react to this? The people of Gwadar, you have these infrastructure development that they don't benefit from. So how do you think it'll go forward? And even the airport, this massive airport you were talking about. So what do you think the sentiments in Gwadar and overall Balochistan province, what will it be like?
So, Bhagya, just a quick question: bargaining of the Pakistani state,
as in negotiating. Would the Pakistan government be able to negotiate better terms or conditions for their people?
So again, a very interesting question. It depends on what they want to get out of it, right? So it's very interesting that there's a lot of literature which is now emerging, especially in Southeast Asia. I think Southeast Asia is fascinating as far as the Belt and Road Initiative is concerned, about how local actors and local politicians and have their own agendas, and their bargaining power vis-a-vis the Chinese is affected by a number of different, sort of variables. For example, in the case of Indonesia, the high-speed railway that connects Jakarta to Bandung, that Indonesia was able to get a better deal out of that project from the Chinese, because there was competition between the Chinese and the Japanese. So having an outside option means that you are able to get better terms for whatever you're trying to do with, so your bargaining power becomes higher. Similar is the case with the Malaysians. ECRL, there was political change in Malaysia. Mahathir said, no, we're not going to do this anymore. He shut off the ECRL, and Malaysia was able to negotiate a better deal with the Chinese, because the ECRL was an important part of whatever they were trying to achieve in Malaysia as well. In the case of Pakistan, on the other hand, that bargaining power isn't there, right? So if the Chinese, in 2015, for example, the Chinese were the only game in town. There were very few foreign investors or foreign firms that were willing to invest in the power sector, for example. So that bargaining power was missing as far as Pakistan is concerned. So that already skews the balance towards the Chinese in terms of the negotiations that you're going to have. And the Chinese, we need to sort of not think of the Chinese as a monolithic actor. This includes different actors, state-owned enterprises, private firms, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the other point which is important is, what do you want to get out of the Belt and Road Initiative, right? Do you want investment in productive sectors? Do you want relocation? Are Chinese firms willing to relocate to your part of the world or not? And the answer to that is that in many developing countries, including Pakistan, that sort of productive capital, that the state's ability to absorb that productive capital, when I talk about productive capital, that means manufacturing in the traditional, sort of classical sense, is very limited. So even though the Pakistani state might say we want Chinese firms to relocate to Pakistan, but the actual framework, the actual infrastructure on the ground to attract that investment, apart from tax breaks, etc., those are easier things to do, has not been provided. And the third point is, in terms of demand, is there a demand from Chinese firms to actually relocate to Pakistan? So all of these factors mean that the Pakistanis' ability to negotiate a better deal, whatever that deal might be, because that better deal is informed by a number of different variables as well, is is more limited. The only thing that's going, I think, is the all-weather strategic partnership between Pakistan and China, and the geographical location, which makes Pakistan important as far as this is concerned. The last few years have been problematic as far as the broader linkages are concerned. Now, as far as this, whether people are going to accept it or not, and especially in Balochistan, I don't know how to sugarcoat it, but they don't care whether people accept it or not. So, it's 12 odd million people out of a country of 220 odd million people. And, it's easier to deal with 12 odd million people. I'm not saying that that's going to be the case, but, again, from a rational political actors or a whatever strategic perspective, you'll try to bring them on board, but there are no indications that that's happening. There was an agreement that was agreed, for example, that was made between these protesters in Gwadar and the local administration that wasn't implemented. So you can make all of these deals and not implement it. So again, that sort of strategic requirement to actually implement any, sort of negotiated settlement remains limited, to say it.
Unfortunately, we are running short of time. There are so many questions that are coming in. Unfortunately, we don't have the time to engage with all of those questions. So I guess we'll have to wrap up today's session, the last of the Center for Global Asia's final event in Shanghai for this year 2022. So ladies and gentlemen, we look forward to seeing you again in January for a fresh set of views and events in 2023. And until then, wish you a pleasant evening or a pleasant day and take care. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bhagya. Thank you, Tansen. Thank you, team. Thank you for having me.